Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for making it to the final report presentation of the China Knowledge Network of this year. That's quite a special occasion. My name is Raoul Bunskoek and I'm heading the Klingendahl China Center. And we run the China Knowledge Network together with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the Leiden Asia Center. And today it is our great pleasure to have Louise van Schaik and Ties Dams of the Klingendahl Institute here with us to present a report on China's status in international climate negotiations. It's titled A Matter of Principle. But today we do things slightly different. Before the presentation by the authors, we have Paul van der Locht here with us, who is the head of the climate team at the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he'll share with us some of the experiences of the Netherlands with Chinese counterparts in climate negotiations as an introduction. So the floor is yours, Paul. Looking forward to hear what you have to say. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I've started this position a couple of months ago. But I have been posted to China and I've been posted to Brazil, and I was at the COP. So when this invitation came, I thought I really want to give my opinion about what I saw in Belém and what I've seen in China, even though it's a long time ago. And sorry, I have to stand here. And sort of put these things together. Let me start by saying that if for everyone that was at COP, China was hugely present and the EU was hugely absent. It was very striking that when you entered the COP area, there was this huge pavilion of China, and the EU had some sort of member state country pavilions, but they were sort of tucked away, and I think that this was all because of sort of the cost of the pavilions, but China clearly made a different decision as the EU. And it was packed. So the people were queuing up like stuff was being handed out at the stand. And I think that was the side of sort of the audience being drawn to China, but also President Lula. I think at the entry of the COP and the high-level segment, he was full of praise for the role of China in the climate negotiation and working towards this transition to say a decarbonized economy. So China was praised for the electric cars, for the making solar cheaper, etc. So a completely different take on what the climate negotiations should deliver. And the EU was not so much praised for their role in the negotiations. And of course, for the EU, that was quite uncomfortable. I want to sort of give you a quote that I read, I think, this week online, which I think is very telling, and it's also for the writers of this report. So and it said, I think it's from somebody from Climate Kick wrote, we've had a decade of politics of climate, now we enter the decade of economics of climate. And I think that what, I want to add one other thing is that I think the EU overestimated the friendship of Brazil. And I lived there for 4 years, and I think it's I can very much relate to that position, because Brazil and Brazilians feel like, okay, they're part of us, they're close to us, but they're very close to BRICS, and they're very close to China, and they're very close to economic relations and the economic side of things. And I think and I also saw some of the recommendations in the report, it's still very much leaning towards we should convince the rest of the world of the politics. China is a polluter. China is even historically now one of the major emitters, but it's not the argument that's gonna win them over in the end. At least that's the sense I got in Belém. And so these two things together, where the BRICS, a chair that looks like they had very strong ambitions for COP, but they very much pulled it into sort of the economic realm, the political realm. And I think it was almost impossible not to. In the final stages of the negotiations, it was very, very exciting. So I was in the EU coordination room, I think for the first time, at least in the COPs that I've done, there was a real sense of we might not go along with this proposal. We might even say no. So it was actually on the table, like we could say no to this as well. And I think that is telling, but it's also telling that in the end, that is not in Europe's interest, right? So in the end, I think it was concluded that we should invest in this, keep investing in this process, even though it was very far from what the EU aimed for. I think the sense that Europe was sort of put in this position by the chair and by the other sort of major players, I think that didn't happen. Well, maybe in the past it happened before. Maybe in there was one other COP where we had a very bad position. But the way like we were sort of singled out and put pressure on by the chair, like how can you not see that this is the outcome, that the only outcome that is possible, was very overpowering also for the EU negotiator. I think for China, I think for the years that I lived in China, I think they make a strong case of like you have to hear them out, and I also felt that when I was there, I think I think Europe is still quite impatient with sort of trying to sort of move to the position that they can sort of hear all the arguments that China brings to bear, and I think in the way forward, it will take patience to really sort of get the full scope of what China is trying to sort of do in this world, and for Europeans to understand. We have our climate envoy who has, with a number of other European envoys, a very good dialogue, set up a good dialogue with China. But also, if you see sort of the dialogue, the way the dialogue is progressing, it's not moving fast. So it's really like you can almost predict what you'll get back on the European position. So it is a matter of like, okay, how can we really find sort of cooperation that will support that dialogue rather than just keep doing it over and over again. But at least it's good that we have it, because I think it's one of the few entry points that we have. Another quote I want to share, and then I'll hand over to the research, is the one that our ambassador to the UN shared. And she said, like, you can no longer sort of rely on multilateralism to deliver on your key challenges, but you have to create sort of cooperation with other countries to support multilateralism. And I think that is a task that we now all have. So it's very challenging with what the United States is doing. Like anything that has climate or environment or multilateralism in it is under pressure. But to try and find China on areas where it wants to work with us, to support the work that we do on climate, I think China has a lot to offer in the way it deals with their climate situation. Could support sort of the multilateral negotiations as well. So in summary, I'm really happy that you did this study, and I think it's for the negotiating team, both in the Netherlands and in the European negotiating team. It's very valuable to have sort of a deep dive of what's going on and how can we sort of put things together. In the recommendations, I think this economic side and the weakness of multilateralism at the moment and how to support that and how to get back to that situation, and also to look at sort of the politics of climate that Europe sort of uses, contrary to sort of how other countries now use it, could be stronger. So how can we find them on areas where they have something to gain from us? And I think that also means not just China. I think it's also looking at Brazil and looking at India, looking at others. So if Europe sort of singles itself out as sort of the only defender of the politics, it might become very hard. So we have to sort of dive in deeper on this economic side, I think. Thanks a lot, and look forward to the presentation and the discussion. So thanks.
So Paul, if I may, because you are still here, I think one of the issues that we include in the report, and I will present a little bit more the report later on, is this discourse on global north, global south. I didn't hear you say anything about the global south, and I didn't hear you use the word. But of course, because you've been based in Brazil, and also how you pointed out this BRICS dynamics, and China also, as said, the G77 and China group as the presenter of the global south. So how do you view this issue, and how should European diplomats like you deal with it? Should we completely avoid it? Is that at all possible? How should we go about this narrative?
Yeah, sorry, you're right. My sense is that not a lot changed in sort of the situation where China will defend it no matter what. But we did sort of found a little bit around it with the way sort of climate finance is reported. So for example, the development bank outflows are now measured with sort of by accident maybe, then also includes the contribution of China. The tropical forest forever facility, China didn't commit to anything, but they might contribute. So any instrument that sort of pulls them in, that feels safe for them, that they're not being pulled into saying we're not a developing country, is, I think, a small step forward. And I think we also noticed in the negotiations that they were trying to sort of back out of some of the principles of the NCQG in the new commitment, so that they would sort of refer to older text. So that would sort of leave out the role of developing countries also being able to contribute rather than having to. So that's something I think in the negotiations to defend. So any small step, try to sort of find instruments where they're included in the financiers, but don't make too big a sort of advertisement that this is climate finance, because then they'll back out. I think on the can Europe get them out of this position? What do you think? I don't think so, because I think it's so related also to the WTO, to all these other fora. So if they give it up here, and the same is for, I think, well, Brazil, I think it's a different story, and India also, I think so. I mean, Brazil really needs the funding, right? I mean, it's not a poor country, but the chances that they have are quite large. So I don't know, I think like Brazil might be easier, and India, but I think China, because of sort of the whole construct, I don't think they're going to move. But
this is why we titled the report Matter of Principle. I think I don't need it because I have also another microphone. Okay. But this was the reason why we use this title, that we also feel that it's a kind of non-negotiable issue. So with that, I would really like to thank you for your contribution, and I think it's also super fascinating to continue the conversation later on. So thanks a lot. So let's move on with the actual presentation of the report. So the report is going to be published next week. Maybe for the next slide, we included colleague Thies Dams from the China Center in Klingendael and also Leiden University. We included some slides on what this makes this issue policy relevant, what was the research question that we researched, how does it work in this United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, this world between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1 as it's called, so the G77 and China, the developing countries group, and the richer countries, usually the kind of OECD countries from the past. What is going on more generally in EU-China climate relations, how can we classify this distinction between, on one hand, the common interest in the global energy transformation, but also the element of competition over clean tech and the critical raw materials issue, dependency. Then indeed this ideological adherence as a matter of principle, and also what we came up with as recommendations. So the Context and policy relevant is really that China is the biggest polluter, 4 times as much as the EU in terms of emissions. And it also still builds coal-fired power plants, and still quite a lot, and its energy dependency on coal is also still relatively high. But that being said, it's also installed more renewables last year than all the other countries in the world together. So it's also really massive in renewable energy, and a real promoter of these clean technologies, the solar panels, the electrical vehicles, and if you travel around the world, you also see them everywhere. Well, in our view from the Netherlands, China is a big country, a superpower economically, but also in terms of power politics. And therefore, if you would ask, for instance, probably the average Dutch person on the street, is China a developing country? They would say, because also developing country in our definition is something which is economically defined and also has to do with your level of capabilities. And that was also very much in this principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities that I will talk about a bit more later on. But that is a different view than perhaps, let's say, developing countries as a group and having a shared colonial history. So the G77 and China are a group in these climate talks, and they regularly accuse and put pressure on the EU, on the West, to pay more. That's of course also a bit of a problem for a country like the Netherlands, because we also have competing priorities, and developing cooperation budgets are under pressure. There is more pressure to invest in, for instance, defense, but we also had a debate on the effectiveness of aid, and if there is a willingness to provide development cooperation, then the least developed countries are more considered the beneficiaries of these than the richer, say, developing countries. So that makes it a bit difficult issue to justify why, you would still call countries developing countries, and we don't feel they are developing countries. So that issue spoils a bit the party, and also thereby undermines the public support for the COPs. And then I haven't even talked about the Americans that of course pulled out under the current Trump government of the Paris Agreement, but are also very hostile towards, let's say, the developing country status of China. So the question we posed in this report is really, how is China using this developing country status? And also, how can the EU and the Netherlands respond best to this? What drives China's climate diplomacy? How is it using the developing country status? What are the advantages, disadvantages? Is it influencing the relationship between China and the Netherlands and the EU? And how can it be addressed? So we looked at the literature that's available on this topic. It's not a lot. There's a lot on EU-China relations in the field of climate and energy transition. But if you look specifically at this developing country status issue, then it's relatively limited. So we also did a couple of interviews with experts working in various EU countries, EU institutions, and also from other fellow think tanks. And that was quite insightful. Yeah. So this is a slide that illustrates this, let's call it UNFCCC firewall. So again, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is a treaty from 1992, and it's also the framework under which the conferences of the parties are organized each year, and under which the Paris Agreement was negotiated. And there you see that in 1992, the world was basically divided in 3 categories, and countries could decide themselves in which category they would fall. So it was a system of self-identification, as it's called. So you had the G77 and China, the developing countries. Then you had the OECD countries, they are green on the map. And then you had also countries with economies in transition, and that were the former Soviet Union countries. So in 1992, they were still developing. Well, if you look at this today, then how is it really resembling how the world is organized in terms of economic development? So a country like Singapore, but also current EU member states like Poland or Cyprus are on this map, not in, let's say, the green chord. But it proved very difficult, and I think that's also diplomatic, or if you like, international relations lesson from the climate negotiations. It was quite a stupid idea to have such a strict division at that time, and to allow this to go on, and not to agree upon criteria for graduation from one category to the other. But if you look at the actual development level, so we also looked at it, and I've simplified a bit the figures, but then you also see that China is still, in terms of GDP per capita, way behind the EU and also the Netherlands, which is, in the end of the day, a ridiculously rich country. This is on record. But it's also true if you look at the figures, and of course it's also capital. But nevertheless, despite the difference, you can see that China is now also, according to the World Bank classification, an upper middle income country. That being said, there is also quite a division within China. So there is very rich Chinese, but there is also still 200 million Chinese that are really not so rich. And also some parts of China, like Hong Kong or Macau, are of course also stand out as more affluent than other parts of the country. And if you look at purchasing power, one of our colleagues just returned from China. Then of course there is also a difference for what you can buy for €1 in China and what you can buy here in the Netherlands. In terms of emissions, you can see that China is really a way bigger emitter than the US and also the EU as other big players. But you can also see that they might have peaked in 2024 or 2025 because of this massive energy transformation that's ongoing towards clean energy, renewables. It could be the case that they have peaked, and also some economic cooling of some sectors where a lot of emissions come from, like the building sector, for instance. But it looks quite positive, but nevertheless the amount of today is quite heavy. And in terms of climate change, everything that you have in the atmosphere today, like CO2, stays in there for another couple of decades. So the effect has continuing implications. Then if you look at the per capita emissions, so how much emissions per Chinese person, you can see that they are still quite a lot lower than, for instance, the United States or Russia, South Korea. Remarkably, the EU is behind. So on the one hand, that's because China is the factory of the world, so we have outsourced some of our emissions of the products that we use here. So if they are produced in China, then the emissions are also in China. On the other hand, it's also because the EU is doing quite well with renewables in the mix. We use a lot of nuclear, and we have also switched from coal to gas way earlier. So we're already much less coal dependent, and coal is the most polluting of all the energy sources. So here you can see indeed this coal dependency, which is still really high in China. Well, they also have a keen interest to get rid of it because it's also causing a lot of pollution. And the pollution levels in China were also one of the reasons why the Chinese leadership decided to act really on energy transition and climate policy, because they also want to have a clean air where all the Chinese could breathe. And if you look at today's cities, they're already less polluted than they were in the past, and even also less polluted than, for instance, a city in India like New Delhi. But nevertheless, still high coal dependency. So The ambitions of China are to become climate neutral in 2060, and so in the graph that I showed previously, you can also see that it's going down until 2060 and peaking before 2030. But what we see now is that they might already have peaked in 2025, so 5 years earlier than. So that could also illustrate that their ambitions were not so ambitious. But it's also an indication that it's really going fast with this energy transformation. So clean technologies are also this new business model. At the General Assembly, Xi Jinping also announced new targets and even reduction targets. Climate change is also in line with their ideas about a community of shared mankind, about ecological civilization, also a lot of priority in China on, for instance, the issue of biodiversity. And you can see that China is now even classified in international relations as a electrostate, and then the US would more and more be a petrostate. So petrostate is a country that sells fossil fuels and is also very dependent on fossil fuels. Well, the US economy is still quite diversified in comparison to, for instance, Russia or Saudi Arabia, but still, this is quite illustrative. And in terms of energy profile and also the interest in energy transition, the EU is also more aligned with China than with the US at this moment in time. Okay, next. Then China is exempted from providing climate finance because it has this developing country status. But at the same time, it is providing climate finance and also has done some voluntary reporting. So maybe not as transparent as we do our reporting, but nevertheless, they really do provide a lot. And that's to a large extent support to third countries for renewable energy, which of course they then have to buy from Chinese producers. But through the Belt and Road Initiative, actually most of the investments are nowadays in the field of renewables in other countries. And that's quite big and also quite impactful. And also this is something you observe if you travel, that you see a lot of solar wind parks financed by and built by Chinese constructors. So this is a graph that illustrates this, and there you can also see in which countries the Belt and Road Initiatives investments are made and in which sectors. You can see that there is still a bit of oil, a bit of coal support and gas support, but there is also really a lot of support for renewable energy in the countries where Belt and Road Initiatives take place. And then I would like to hand over to my colleague, Ties Dams, who's our sinologist also and who has also looked at these specific questions as the identity issues.
Very good. Thank you very much, Louisa. And with the sinologists in the room, I do have to say I'm not a sinologist in the strict sense, although I've been interested in China for a long time. In fact, I'm a political philosopher, and I was asked here to contribute to this report exactly on not the objective or supposedly objective standards for what a developing country makes distinct from a developed country, but rather on the subjective question, because we're talking about a question of status, which is in and of itself a very subjective thing. It's about who you believe to be yourself and whether you can claim the right for others to accept you for who you think you are. That's what status in general, I think, is. And this part of the report focuses in on that, right? So why does it matter? Not necessarily in the objective or the data-driven quantitative terms, but rather in the qualitative terms for China to, irrespective of the interest attached to a development country status, why does it matter for China to adhere to that status? What does it mean within the broader political context and historic context? And as we are often reminded in the CKN context, very rightfully so, especially when you talk about this aspect of the question, you have to bring yourself into the equation. And I think it matters a great deal who is raising this matter of principle. And maybe we can come back to that later on. For China to be part of the club of countries who have risen from colonial humiliation to a place where they are now is a very important and very deeply entrenched part of its political culture in general, but also in its diplomacy. It has been from the start. It won recognition on the world stage as China, precisely because of the support of all those non-aligned countries from the Bandung Conference to the 70s onwards. That's not a legacy to forget afterwards. China has remembered that legacy. It has always relied on those deep historic ties to the non-Western developing world as really the basis of its place in the world. And you can see this in its various initiatives in global governance from BRI, but also now in the global initiatives, global development initiatives, and the three others that really at once present China as a major power, but always link into that shared history of the post-colonial world. And it's very successful. I say without an intention, at least, of cynical resonance. It's very successful, and it is also very successful in climate diplomacy, as I've learned, especially in the G77 group. And then I think we can start to bring ourselves a little bit into the equation. So an interesting change in rhetoric, I've emphasized the continuity, but a change in rhetoric took place from at around 2023. Before 2023, Xi Jinping said China has always been, and he repeated this also in speeches related to this topic, China has always been part of the group of developing countries. After 2023, Xi Jinping says China will always be part of the group of developing countries. A small change in temporal perspective, emphasizing the past to emphasizing a future, a perpetual future no less, that you cannot prove was triggered by, but did coincide with the HR 1107, if I remember correctly from the top of my head, passed in the US Congress, a bill called the PRC is not a developing country act. And so it matters a great deal who's asking China to change its status. And it's not just about the status itself, but it is very much about the right and the power to determine for China, and indeed I think this is a shared interest for many countries to determine for themselves, as is entrenched in this system also legally, what their status is, who they are on the world stage. And I think this is a pattern that we explore in a little bit more depth in the report, but I just wanted to highlight where, for instance, also in the negotiations to the of entry of accession of China to the WTO, the United States was very much approaching this status question as a matter of principle. And China responded by adhering to that status, and indeed, perhaps even more fundamentally, to the power or the right to determine that status for itself as a matter of principle. And in fact, in those negotiations, late 90s, early 2000s, or in 2001, it was the EU and European member states that were able to loosen some of that gridlock by drawing the negotiations specifically with China a little bit away from the matter of principle and the status, and rather negotiate with China on the duties or privileges attached to that status. And there, China was very willing, pragmatically, to negotiate and to come to a solution. And the EU found quite a bit of backlash from the US in giving up exactly this matter of principle. And so I think there's a pattern that really sheds some light on why, aside from the benefits and the duties, aside from the status itself, really, why the power or the right to determine that status matters to China, whether that's in the arena of climate diplomacy or somewhere else. Indeed, it is a shared interest to maintain that right throughout different policy fields. And so that short history also points to a useful way of thinking about engaging with this issue going forward, also in this arena. Yes, and so in 2023, what happened was China, or Xi Jinping, changed the verb tense, you could say, in his sentence to the future to emphasize that indeed that right to determine its status for itself, China would adhere to. And I would say that at least the pragmatic calculus of whether China would be pressured enough to give it up has changed in China's favor, right? So I was very interested also in the comment by Upal at the beginning of this sense of the EU being singled out. If this common Western front isn't going to be happening in any policy field anymore, then I think China can quite easily make the calculation that they can indeed now worry a little bit less about the political pressure on that point. And that's supported by the fact that indeed other rich countries also don't graduate. So China has a comfortable position where, for instance, they rightfully, perhaps, or probably can indeed claim to or offer to not claim some of the benefits associated with development country status, for instance, in the WTO, as Li Qiang did, thereby being gracious and magnanimous, giving the world, this gift of not claiming what's actually rightfully theirs, and at the same time not undermine the shared interest of other post-colonial or non-Western nations to claim this status for itself. That being said, there have been some, I would say, weakness signals of other developing countries, at least as we've been able to find in sort of open source research. Other developing countries, for instance, small island developing states, being somewhat more irritated about China's adherence to this status in what is increasingly a G2 world with two superpowers, and China being one of those two. So that is perhaps a development also to think about going forward. I think we can talk about this a lot, but let me give the floor back to Louisa to transition towards recommendations. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Ties. And this really makes it so clear, that this developing country status is not something you can really fully negotiate about or attack. You should deal with it in a clever way, what Paul also talked about. And it also then becomes a tricky part in the overall context of this EU-China relations, where we see that there is a lot of worry in Europe about the Chinese overcapacity of electrical vehicles, batteries, solar panels. In Europe in the past we had in the field of agriculture our own problems with too much milk and butter and so on and so forth, and now the Chinese have kind of the same, and Europe increasingly says that means that producers in Europe can't compete. So that's a bone of contention. Then the other bone of contention is, of course, the critical raw materials dependencies, where we increasingly realize these dependencies, but perhaps also the chips. The issue of the coal-fired power plants, Commissioner Hoekstra, EU Commissioner Hoekstra has also said things about that in the lead-up to the COP in Belém. Why are you presenting yourself as a renewables leader when still building coal-fired power plants at home, although no longer abroad? Why complaining that we don't pay enough, but will you also pay? Then a small but not insignificant issue is that the EU in the future is likely to do more offsets abroad. So it has a climate target, but it plans to use a credit system to do part of the effort abroad, because for climate change it doesn't matter where on earth these emissions are reduced. But are we going to buy then also these credits again in China, as we have also done in the past? Or are we going to co-finance the BRI renewables investments? And if we do that, is that going to be a new topic of negotiations? And I think that's really something Europe should start thinking about. So all in all, we have this joint interest in the global energy transition, both the EU and also China. But it's not, let's say, an automatic issue where there's only love between the EU and China. So in terms of recommendations, it's really about managing expectations with regard to climate finance. Also a little bit towards our own NGOs that can also be pretty firm on demanding the EU to spend more money. We also feel that the developing country status that Ties already talked about in different international contexts is organized in different ways. Even in other multilateral environmental agreements, there is differences between countries that in the one COP are a developing country and in the other not. So if an overall UN reform takes place, then this could also be something that might be tackled. For instance, if the biodiversity and the climate COPs are taking place simultaneously, then it becomes really obvious that countries are in different categories in different sets of negotiations. Point out also this developing country status of other rich countries like Saudi Arabia, like Singapore. Is that still justifiable? Also up the understanding with the least developed countries and with NGOs that perhaps it's not in their interest too to stick to the overall group of G77 and China, because probably they are more entitled to get this climate finance than the richer developing countries. Consider this issue of these offsets that I just talked about. If the EU is going to pay for emission reductions abroad as part of its new 2040 package, that says that 5% should be flexible credits, then consider whether you put it in this new forest facility of Brazil or in renewables projects under the BRI. You can make a choice for both. But if you do it, you have to think about it and do it in a deliberate way, and then it could maybe be part of this overall package of EU-China relations. And finally, the narrative of the Global South, with China being the defender of the Global South, India is also sometimes doing this, is not something we automatically have to copy. We can also make our own choices in which narratives we would like to use to categorize the world. At the same time, of course, we can emphasize these benefits of the global energy transformation that occur to all the countries in the world, but especially the countries that have to have a high import dependency on fossil fuels. As the Netherlands is also going to organize this conference with Colombia in April of 2026. So I would like to thank you actually for your attention. These are the recommendations, and we hope that you have questions for us. I would like to emphasize that this is a report we wrote together, but also with other authors. Peter Pauw was one of the authors, and also we had contributing authors Sander Chan, Ellen Schepers and Steven Verburg, who contributed to this work, and we're also very grateful for them. And the report will come out next week. Thank you.